Hello, this is the section 2.5 lesson on the topic of percents. Let's start off with a definition of percents. Well, a percent is simply a fraction where the denominator is 100. So a percent is just a special type of a fraction. So when working with percents, we're going to have to remember a lot of the same key ideas that we talked about when working with fractions. We're going to have numerators, we're going to have denominators, and we're going to have whole amounts. So as a simple example, the percent 10% is equal to the fraction 10 over 100, which could be reduced down to the fraction 1/10. Or in general, p% could be written as p divided by 100. So let's take a simple example. Let's suppose that 35% of the trees at an arboretum are evergreens. So we could think of this as meaning that there are exactly 100 trees in our arboretum and exactly 35 of them are evergreens. Now that may not be exactly what's going on. There doesn't have to be exactly 100 trees in our arboretum. So we could think of this in more general terms as meaning that we take the number of evergreens and divide it by the number of trees in our arboretum, and that's going to have to equal the fraction 35 over 100. So this equation right here looks very much like a ratio that we have been working with here in Chapter 7. And so when working with percent problems, we're going to be able to use a lot of the same tools as we have when working with ratio problems. So when working with percents, there are three main tools that we can use. And again, these tools are going to look very much like the tools that we've used when working with ratios. Number one, we can use fractions. Number two, we can use simple math drawings. And then number three, we can use percent tables. In this section, we're going to use mostly percent tables, which are going to look very much like ratio tables. Next section, we're going to use some math drawings. These are going to be just simple strip diagrams. But start off with, let's talk a little bit more about fractions and then do an example of working with percents and using fractions. So just to refresh our memory, let's talk about some commonly used percents and their corresponding fractions. So 25% is the same as 1/4. 50% is the same as 1/2. 75% is the same as 3/4, and so on and so forth. So again, to refresh our memory, p% we can represent as a fraction p over 100, or maybe in more general terms, we could represent this as a portion of our whole divided by the whole amount. So just like when working with fractions, we always start off with some whole amount. That becomes our denominator, and our numerator can be thought of as a portion of the whole or some pieces of the whole. And so let's look at a simple example of using that idea of representing a percentage as a portion over a whole and working with that representation. So Susie must pay 6% on her purchase of $44. How much tax must Susie pay? Well, let's start off thinking about what does 6% mean. Well, 6% means 6 over 100. Well, we can think of that as a portion, which is our tax, divided by our whole, which is our purchase of $44. And so for right now, we're going to kind of ignore this portion of that equation and work with just these fractions here. And so we want to solve for tax. And so what we can do is kind of a cross multiplication, not exactly a full cross multiplication. We're going to just take the 44 over to the other side. And so we have 6 over 100 times 44, which is going to equal our tax. Now if we do this arithmetic on the left, 6 divided by 100 is 0.06 times 44. And that's going to equal our tax. Now, if we do this arithmetic on the left, we'll skip the details. You can verify this on your own, but 0.06 times 44 is equal to 2.64, and that's going to equal our tax. So there's our answer. Our tax is going to be $2.64. Now, you may have said to yourself, this seemed like an awful lot of work to solve this problem. Why did we really need to set up fractions like that and then cross multiply and then do this arithmetic? What you may have said to yourself, well, I could have just jumped right to this step. Take 44% times 0.06. 0.06 is 6%, and just done that arithmetic. Well, what we're doing here is really justifying why this problem is solved by this arithmetic. So we started off with our definition of what a 6% means, and then we did a little cross multiplication, and then we get to this step. So again, all this work here justifies why we can solve the problem with just 0.06 times 44. Now, our second tool that we can use to work with fractions or with percentages is math drawings. And these are going to be the same math drawings as what we've used all the times we've worked with fractions. So for instance, if I want to make a math drawing of 50%, well, 50% as a fraction is 1/2, so I'm going to take a whole amount, divide it into 2 equal pieces, shade one of those pieces, and there's 50% of that whole. Here's 75%. We take that whole, divide it up into 4 pieces, select 3 of them. That's 75% of the whole. Here's a strip diagram that we're going to use a lot in our next section. 10% is 1/10. That means we're going to take our whole strip, divide that up into 10 equal pieces, select one of those pieces, and we're all done. The third tool that we can use is a percent table. And this percent table is going to look very much like a ratio table that we've used in the past couple of sections. But instead of writing this table horizontally, we're going to write it vertically. And in each row is going to have, the first column is going to be a percent, and the second column is going to be some proportion. If we have 100% in that first column, that's going to correspond to a whole amount. And then to go from one row of this table to the next row, we're going to have to multiply by some number. So as a simple example, let's go back to this problem of Susie paying taxes on her purchase of $44, and let's solve this problem using a ratio table. And so if we look at our problem here, we're going to have to pay 6%, and this $44, that's her whole amount. And so let me get my pen here. So 100% corresponds to our purchase of $44. And in the end, we want to calculate 6% of that amount. So 6% is going to correspond to what proportion? And so we're going to need to go from 100% down to 6% by multiplying by some number. Well, to go from 100% to 6%, that's a little bit complicated going one step. So we're going to put an intermediate step in here where we go through 1. So I'm going to put a 1% here. And so to go from 100% down to 1%, we're going to multiply by 1 over 100. And so we're going to have to do that same thing over here on the right. We're going to have to multiply by 1 over 100. So 44 divided by 100 is 0.44. That arithmetic is pretty easy to do. Now to go from 1% down to 6%, we need to multiply by 6. And so we need to do the same thing on the right. So 0.44 times 6. We'll skip the details. You can verify this calculation on your own. We get 2.64. And so there's our final answer. 6% of our purchase is going to be $2.64. So, exact same answer that we found using fractions, just a little bit different way of doing it. Now let's talk about 3 different types of percent problems that we might encounter. So we've seen this equation before. P% is P over 100, which is the proportion divided by the whole amount. So there's 3 quantities involved here. There's a percent, there's a proportion, and there's a whole amount. In any percent problem, any one of those three things could be unknown. So the type of percent problem we have depends on what's unknown. We could have the proportion unknown, we could have the percent unknown, or we could have the whole amount unknown. In our problem example of Susie paying taxes, we knew the percentage and we knew the whole amount, we just didn't know the proportion. So that example was an example of an unknown proportion or portion amount. Now let's look at an example of our second type. Here's the question. 3 is what percent of 8? And so we can think of 8 as being our whole and 3 as being our portion. And the question is, what's the percent? So let's set up a ratio table to solve this. And so we know that our whole amount is 8, so let's write that down. 100% corresponds to 8. And then we know that 3 is our portion that we have in the end. And so down here, I'm going to put a 3. And so the question is, what percentage corresponds to a portion of 3? So here in this right column, I need to go from 8 to a 3. Well, going directly from an 8 to a 3 is kind of complicated, so we're going to add a couple of intermediate steps here. I could go to 1, but to go from 8 to 1, I'd have to divide by 8 or multiply by 1/8. Multiplying 100 by 1/8 would be a little bit complicated. So let's add an intermediate step before we get to a 1. And I'm going to add a 2 here. So I'm going to go from an 8 to a 2, and that's easy. I can multiply by 1/4. Now on the left here, I also need to multiply by 1/4. Well, 100 times 1/4, that's 25%. That was pretty easy to do. Now, let's add a 1 here. So to go from a 2 to a 1, I need to multiply by a 1/2. And so I need to multiply 25% times 1/2. Well, half of 25% is 12.5%. So 12.5% of 8 is equal to 1. Now we can do one last step here. Let's multiply by 3. And so we're going to multiply by 3. So 12.5% times 3 is 37.5%. And that arithmetic is pretty easy to do in my head. So there we go. There's our answer. So 3 is 37.5% of our whole 8. Let's do one last example. A store gave $15,000 to schools in the community. This $15,000 represents 3% of the store's annual profit. What was the store's annual profit? So what we're given here is a portion, 15,000, and we're told that's 3%. We want to know what the whole annual profit was. So let's set up our ratio table here. We're told that 3% corresponds to 15,000. Now just to simplify things, I'm not going to write the zeros. So 3% corresponds to 15,000. What we want in the end is 100% corresponds to what? So we need to go from a 3 to a 100. Well, doing that directly is a little bit complicated, so let's go through 1 here. And so I'm going to put a 1 here. To go from a 3 to a 1, I'm going to multiply by 1/3. So I need to do the same thing over here. So 15 times 1/3 is 5. So 1% of their annual profit was $5,000. Now I need to go from 1% to 100%, so I multiply by 100. And I need to do the same thing over here. So 5 times 100 is 500. And so there's my answer. their annual profit was $500,000.